So just to kind of recap, my name's Ben Pfeiffer. I study fireflies here in Texas. I'm a master naturalist. I'm also based here in New Braunfels. And this is just kind of a fun project for me and something that I've kind of devoted part of my life to for the last 10 years. And I look forward to talking with everybody tonight. NEPSOT in general has been one of my biggest supporters over many years that I've given this presentation, and I absolutely adore speaking to the group. They are definitely the best groups that I speak to, and so anytime I get a chance to, anybody's interested, then I love to do so. So thank you for the invitation and inviting me. As Kathleen mentioned, I'm going to be talking obviously of course about fireflies, but I'll also be talking about specific ways to think about firefly habitat and maybe ways that you can improve habitat in your own yard or on land that you might have. And then I'll talk about a new certification program I'm going to be launching that'll be interesting. And I will end the presentation by asking you all some questions on ways that you might be able to help me help fireflies. So I look forward to asking that as well. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you would just make sure to mute your mic. That's just helpful for like distractions that don't distract me while I'm speaking.
So it's kind of weird, but if you look around, you'll see that so much of our land is.
And if you've got any questions or anything, feel free to post them in the chat box in there, and I will get to those at the end. Sometimes I'll ask questions throughout that, and if you think of something, feel free to ask it. There's no dumb questions whatsoever. This all takes time to learn, and I love to be able to talk about this and answer anything. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So what are fireflies, and what really are they? And for most people, they know that they're beetles, but they're beetles, and they come from a very diverse family of world. There's around 400 species of beetles in the order Coleoptera. All fireflies kind of belong to the family called Lampyridae. And they go by different names in Texas, such as lightning bugs, firefly, or that glowy thing over there in the tree. But whatever you call them, they are beetles and they do flash. Fireflies in the family Lampyridae share several shared characteristics. And these are important as a scientist when you're studying fireflies so that you can differentiate between different beetle species. Fireflies as adults and as juveniles bioluminesce. And so this means in their adult stage they flash, but also as juveniles, as larvae, they also flash as well. If they lack this ability, then oftentimes they might be classified in another subfamily or family group or order. They all have relatively soft, elongated bodies. We sometimes like to call these squishy beetles because they're relatively kind of soft, and you can kind of squish them pretty easily compared to other beetles that might have a more hard shell. They have a flattened shield that covers the back of their head. This is called the pronotum, and up in the right-hand corner, you can see that kind of half-moon shaped shield cover right there. The head generally telescopes in and out underneath that head shield or pronotum. And the head shield's usually generally large, and it has colorful markings on it. Sometimes it's yellow, tan, red, orange pigment, and occasionally we'll have like a black spot or a black band or a splotch, kind of like the example over in the lower right-hand corner. And most species are about 5 to 20 millimeters long. About a 20 to 25 millimeter long is about an inch, to give you an example. Some fireflies up in the South America get as much as several inches long. And there was an entomologist who used to tell a story one time that if fireflies were the size of house cats, then people would be afraid to go outside at night. It's like that. Brief anatomy on fireflies. I put this together just so that you can understand what they're kind of made of and how we kind of study them a little bit. As I mentioned before, there's a pronotal spot on the back, or a pronotal, it's called a pronotum, and in that pronotum, it's called a pronotal spot. Why that's important is because when we want to determine a species of a firefly, we oftentimes look at this marking on the back of its head shield. It's not always diagnostic, but it can sometimes help us with identifying that species in the area. Oftentimes, there are more than one species of firefly flying at night. And so we want to try to differentiate between those. They have 11 antenna segments right here. They have something called a scutellum, that is this hard plate that separates the head shield from the wing covers. They have 2 wing covers. These are called elytra, or elytron in the singular form. They've got 6 legs. And they also have what's called an elytral margin. Not all fireflies have this yellow band that you might notice here. Some do and some don't, but it's also can be helpful for a diagnostic feature to differentiate between different species. Some fireflies will have wing covers that are all black, and some will have very narrow margins, and some will have it where it's kind of blended a little bit. So those are things I look at if I'm trying to like ID a firefly, for example. This image shows the differences between the 2 types of fireflies. Genders, we have female on the left and then male on the right. You can tell from this picture that there are some differences between the 2. On the left with the female, you'll notice that in one of her abdominal segments that she has a lighter colored region here that is a lot more reduced than the male over on the right side. These segments are where they make light and where they flash. And the females generally have 1 light segment, whereas males generally have 2. The reason for this is a variety of reasons, but the main one is that females don't need to flash as often as males do and devote as much energy to flashing as males do. They need to save that energy to make eggs, for example. So firefly diversity in Texas, we've got about 2,000 species worldwide. In the United States, there's about 180 United States species, and more being identified daily. They predict that there might be another 20 species in the next 10 years or so. There's 45 species in Texas, and of those, about 35 or so are nighttime flying, flashing fireflies. This is a chart showing the firefly life cycle. What most people don't realize is that fireflies spend most of their lifetime in the larval state, which generally occupies about 1 to 2 years of time. And as adults, they spend a relatively short amount of time in that stage, about 3 to 4 weeks. And about the same time it takes for them to pupate as well as an egg. So an example over off to the left here is an example of a firefly larva down in the left-hand corner. This is a firefly pupating up in the upper left-hand corner. And then over to the right is an example of a larva that just hatched. Now, if you remember back to some of the shared characteristics that I talked about with fireflies, as larvae, they need to bioluminesce. And in this case, with this image here, you can see this lighter colored region at the end of their tail here that is glowing essentially. So this is a larva that just hatched from an egg that is glowing and also would share the characteristics of making it in the family Lampyridae. Fireflies are habitat specific as well. They love warm, humid areas, anywhere from forests, fields, marshes, rivers, ponds, and streams. Riparian corridors are one of the most important habitats for fireflies. And this is the interface between the land and a river, for example, and it occupies about 1% of all land types in a particular area. So this is that narrow strip of vegetation that occurs along a river or stream or creek, and this supports the majority of fireflies in an area. Some can live outside of these areas. Some prefer a little bit drier, some like fields and stuff like that. But in general, most of them prefer riparian corridors. And that's the kind of habitat that we like to save the most, or work to save, is because that's the most important. Flash patterns. To most people, the flash of a firefly looks the same as another. And at night, it can be really pretty hard to differentiate between different species that are flashing at the same time. Species has its own fairly distinct flash pattern. Now, if you look to the image to your right, you will see some flashes in a variety of different areas on that image. You'll see some that are higher up in the trees, some that are kind of flashing in the middle, and some that are flashing near the ground. Different fireflies prefer different areas, and that can be helpful for determining species. There's also variation in their flash pattern. So up in the top of the trees there, you see that, you know, they might repeat a flash 3 or 4 times, or once, you know, every so often, whereas others might produce like a shape, like a J shape down there on number 6. And they might repeat a flash in a different color really quickly. So when we talk about flash patterns, usually we need to consider temperature as being a big important factor that affects their flashing. So the hotter the environment, generally the faster they'll flash. Whereas it's cooler, let's say it's 70 degrees, instead of flashing every 4 seconds, they might flash every 6 seconds. So that's something to keep in mind when you go out and look at fireflies, is the temperature out there. As I mentioned, number of flashes, and then the interval of time between flashes also is important to note, and then the time of night too. And that we don't think about. We go out and we just think that, oh, well, it's dark, fireflies can be flashing, they're gonna be flashing the same time, the same way the entire time, but really, they will be flashing differently at different times of night. So early dusk fireflies are gonna flash a little bit differently than those are later in the evening. So how do they choose a mate? Fireflies broadcast signals as they search for females, and males fly in search of females. That's pretty much their goal. You can see a example of this in the image off to the left there. Kind of, that's a flash pattern. And females respond to this different variation in female and male flash timing, and they're looking for a variety of different things. And so I asked the question, what do female fireflies prefer in male fireflies? And it's not a trick question, but they do prefer some things over others. And they generally prefer longer flashes or faster flash rates. I was given this presentation a few years ago in East Texas, and there was this lady in the front of the audience, and I asked this question. I was like, what do females like in males fireflies? And she just sits there and she piped up and she was like, a sense of humor. And so that just cracked me up, and it was really funny. And so I don't know if male fireflies have a sense of humor or not, or if females care or not, but it was funny. So how are fireflies helpful? Generally, they act as kind of nature's pest control. The larvae that you see on the ground are extremely predaceous. So they'll consume snails, earthworms, dead insects. Basically, they're just constantly eating as much as. If you ever catch one and keep one for a little while, you'll notice that they move really quickly. And then if you put it, you know, like a snail with them or whatever, they'll attack it readily. Some adult fireflies, such as Photuris in the genus Photuris, also eat their own kind, and there's a reason for that. They generally act as a good indicator of the health of an environment, and they consume pests basically. If pests are not present due to environmental factors related to pesticides, poor environment, stuff like that, then there won't be any fireflies. So they're very sensitive to changes in their habitat, and that's why they're such a good indicator. They're medically useful as well. They're used in food safety research, cancer research, development of new drugs. They use the compounds in fireflies, luciferin and luciferase, to indicate the presence of like, you know, harmful bacteria in food, whether, you know, a cancer drug is working or not, or suppressing a tumor, for example. So they, once they synthesize the compounds in fireflies, they have been extremely useful. They actually, the chemical companies many years ago, 40, 50 years ago, used to actually pay people to collect fireflies so that they could harvest those compounds. And they used to pay people like 5 cents fly back in the day, and that was contributing to some declines for the fireflies. But luckily, they don't have to do that anymore. Oh, are fireflies disappearing? This is a big question and a common one that's been asked a lot, especially recently in the last few years. And the answer is yes, unfortunately, they are disappearing across many different habitats. They're doing okay in some. The consensus is that in most public and scientific communities that there's just a whole lot fewer fireflies than they used to be. I hear a lot of stories that people tell me about, that they used to see fireflies a lot more abundantly than they used to. And a lot of that sometimes is true, and it's just a trend in our society too, how we interact with the outdoors. I used to say that there was just anecdotal evidence to kind of prove this, but lately there has been empirical evidence that is piling up to definitely validate this argument. For example, just this past year, I participated in a study to evaluate the extinction risk of Texas firefly species. And after the study was done, it was found that 14% of North American firefly species are threatened and are classified as either endangered, critically endangered, or vulnerable. For the first time, we do have a firefly that's going to be on the endangered species list, for example. So that's a sizable number that's out there of fireflies that are threatened, and there's a lot of ones that are just very data deficient that we don't know. What is really important though is known as the urgent need for conservation of their habitats, and specifically of greatest concerns for those local kind of unique adapted species, those that just occur in a geographic area. And Texas has a good number of these that just occur in, let's say, the Edwards Plateau region or the Hill Country region, for example. Oh, why are they disappearing? One of the reasons is pollution and loss of riparian corridors. This image is really great, and it's one that I collected about a couple years ago. And where it's located is San Felipe Spring or Creek in Del Rio. This is one of the most polluted spring-fed creeks in the state of Texas, and this image shows an example of that. And so from pollution from trash and then loss of riparian corridor, since I'm speaking to those that know different species of plants really well in Texas, you might be able to off the bat recognize the plant in the background here, and it's also known as Carrizo cane or arundo. This is an invasive type of cane from Africa or somewhere over there. And what it's done here is it's basically replaced the riparian corridor along this spring-fed system with a monoculture of one vegetation type. And you can see that, to get to the soil level, it would be very difficult for a firefly to get way down to that soil level along that creek to get access to that moisture. And so it's preventing fireflies from firefly females from laying eggs. And also, if you're a firefly in here and you're flashing to a female that's way on the ground, you're going to have a really hard time seeing through this mess of reeds. So Carrizo cane specifically is a huge threat here in Texas, specifically because it spreads so rapidly. The Rio Grande is also, infested with this plant. And this is just an example of one of the problems of facing fireflies. Another one is habitat loss degradation. These are things we're familiar if we live here in the Central Texas corridor. This is things that's happening all over, especially in the last couple of years as everybody moves here. And it's just the clip of habitat loss that's happening in the area is just phenomenal. And once it's gone, it's really hard to get it back. Light pollution is another one. The main thing with light pollution is that it basically prevents fireflies from seeing each other at night. A female that's trying to signal to a male, there's going to be trouble if there's light pollution shining into that habitat and they can't see each other. If they can't see each other, they can't mate and they can't reproduce, and they're eventually no fireflies. So that's pretty simple in that one. And so we can do our job by reducing light pollution. Pesticide use is another one, specifically broad spectrum pesticides. Anything that says beetle kill, basically you're killing all beetles. Fireflies are beetles. So that's one of the reasons. There are some needs for pesticides to control, household insects and stuff like that. But if you use your application at just the right time, it's much better than allowing the pest control companies to decide where they spray. And generally they do they spray all over the place, like this guy down here, to eliminate everything. Water tables is another one. This is just has to do with the pumping of the aquifers. If you think about it, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, there was less pumping of the aquifers, and there used to be more springs that would pop out of the limestone, particularly in our area, and other places. These wet seeps essentially were able to establish like a wet, moist environment that fireflies are able to live in. As aquifers have declined, some of these previously wet areas have dried up. And as soon as they dry up, it's pretty quick for fireflies to disappear from there because it's no longer able to support the life there. So that's an issue. So some ways that you could help. One, the first step is kind of assess your soil health. This is a recommendation because you really are trying to create habitat for firefly food, snails and worms essentially. And if you've got poor soil, then you've got poor habitat for those creatures that fireflies eat. So you can make amendments to your soil to introduce nutrients to your soil. You can also till your soil. Somebody asked once, they were like, how far should I till my soil? And I was like, well, there's recommendations not to go too deep, but a light tilling on the top is probably a good idea so that you can introduce nutrients and water into it. To give you a quick story, in Manhattan, in New York, they have fireflies in Central Park. Now, you can think that's such a huge metropolis, a big city, but they have fireflies there, and one of the ways they maintain that is they actually have special beds that they don't plant anything in, and they just have soil in that they till regularly to allow nutrients to get in, just so that they have a place for fireflies to lay eggs. It took many years to figure this out, and I talked to the guy who was responsible for this a long time ago, and I was just fascinated by it. And New Yorkers love fireflies, and so they're able to maintain this just by doing that. As I mentioned with pesticides, kind of avoid the broad spectrum pesticides that kill, all sorts of things. You can turn out your outside lights as well, especially those that shine into green belts or areas like that. Advocate for adopting local policies to control light pollution is another one. And you can contact your city government to suggest dark sky policies. Example here in New Braunfels, the ordinances towards light pollution haven't been updated since 1986. So while every other city around us has adopted and made some changes, our town is still vastly behind. And part of that was in order to allow industry to come here. But we do have a light pollution problem here in New Braunfels, much more so than a lot of other areas. So at some point, if anybody knows any city council members, go talk to them and advocate for adopting some dark sky policies. They don't have to be the most extreme, but some downward facing lights would be, beneficial. Next species, this is a good one. Become certified. Certify your land as a wildlife or firefly habitat. Let log and leaf litter accumulate. This is just basically helps to, create a place for fireflies to live. Plant trees and native grasses. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Don't overmow your lawn. If you want habitat, then don't mow it basically at certain times of year. Specifically when fireflies are active, it's not a good time to mow. You can start a pollinator or restore prairies, for example. Prairies can support firefly species. And educate your neighbors is a great one. So for the first time, I will be launching a new program to certify your yard for firefly habitat. It will be launching around the February 15th timeframe at firefly.org/certify. I've had the idea to do this for a couple years, and I've been working on it towards the end of this past year and this first part of this year. And basically, I worked to establish some areas of importance that we want to focus on. This will allow you to purchase a sign. I think the sign cost will be around anywhere from $40, $45, something like that, and the cost will get down lower over time. what this will do is it's going to make a big change for people that really want to encourage fireflies in their area. This will also be great for pollinators as well. There's a wonderful shared benefits between doing firefly habitat and also pollinator habitat. Generally, this certification program will focus on kind of a voluntary basis for you to kind of establish these guidelines in your habitat. And there will be a PDF you can download. This is going to be a pretty neat program since it's the first of its kind, and I'm proud to launch it. It'll be focused on 4 areas. One will be cover for firefly larvae and adults. I'm going to talk about this throughout the presentation, just a little bit about this. It's going to encourage increasing plant diversity in areas. This is one of the things I think as, you know, native plant enthusiasts that we'd like to see as well, encouraging native plants as opposed to invasives, for example. It's going to help to educate on reducing light pollution and educating on pesticide usage. So, native plants to help fireflies. So the way that I'd like to think about this is you have to, I think, back up. Sometimes we might like to think about the plants first that we might like to include in our habitat, but really we need to back up and then figure out what we're actually trying to accomplish if we're wanting to plant natives for fireflies. And those natives need to have, like, satisfy some requirements that I believe are important. And the first one is that they need to provide habitat for females. And so these are plants that you know, have like mating habitat that with diverse canopy heights, for example. So these are plants that, you know, can provide a wide variety of different places for a female to crawl up on a blade of grass or on a shrub stick, for example, where she could flash to a male, places that she can hide. And then habitat for females would also include places for her to lay eggs. So this is plants that might throw off a good amount of leaf litter, for example, or trees that, you know, make good logs or break down over time. We also want to provide habitat for larvae, and so these are plants that build soil leaf litter and in places to find food, snails, worms, slugs, soft body insects, and places that help, you know, plants that help trap moisture, for example. So grasses help trap moisture in soil, stuff like that. And then lastly, the least important, but, you know, still important, is operational cover, that I like to call it, for flashing adults. These generally tend to be tall, deciduous, non-deciduous trees that help create a dark environment at night. So you can think about cypress trees, sycamores, even those kind of type of things. If you think of any plants while we're through the course of this presentation that you think might be good firefly plants, let me know. Post it in the chat, because I have a section on the website that lists plants for fireflies, and I've got a list of plants that I will talk about here that generally are kind of facultative plants that do well in wet and non-wet habitats, but I'd love any recommendations. If you're curious on the list, there's an expanded list with scientific names on the firefly.org website underneath Learn Plants for Fireflies. So just click over there and check out that list. I have this information there and a little bit more of an expanded list here. Generally, these are some of the plants that do well for fireflies. There's, like I said, there's a larger list on the website, but these are plants that would do well in a habitat that, you know, is wet and non-wet. And grasses do good. Forbs are wonderful. Frog fruit, for example, can be good in habitat that, you know, is recovering and needs to establish some ground cover. Frostweed, for example, can also be good as well because it can establish they have really broad leaves. A place for a firefly to crawl up, basically, and provide cover. Even vines can be helpful too, as well. And a list of trees here. And some of these are ones that I spend a lot of time in firefly habitat, so you just see a lot of common things that are out there. For example, it's not listed on here, but inland sea oats is a grass that I'm a really big fan of for firefly habitat because it tends to occur in areas that are moist and little like shaded. So that's a great one that I see quite often. As well as, you know, Cytosgrama is another one you see. What does firefly habitat look like in Texas? So this is just going to be a kind of fun walkthrough where we can just kind of like say, you know, what are some examples, Ben, of some habitat that you've seen fireflies? So I find studying habitats just really fascinating to me. Just the diversity out there, and then the change of different like ecoregions and types, and what supports what, drawing conclusions from that, from what you learn. So these are some of the ones that I've seen. This is an enchanted rock in Gillespie County, for example. And if you're studying habitat, generally you kind of want to look what's going on here. You see, we have a wide variety of different, you know, vegetation types. We have tall trees. We've got, you know, some shorter shrubs there. We've got a wide open kind of ephemeral stream here that does retain some moisture. This would be a pretty decent firefly habitat. That might signify it's a little bit drier, on the drier side, because of the gravel here is probably not able to retain as much moisture. But a decent habitat, this enchanted rock, just a beautiful area. West Texas, a place that very few people actually get to see because a lot of them are dominated by big ranches. This is a Fox Canyon Ranch that I got an opportunity to visit in 2018. Absolutely blown away by it. It's now owned by a, I think, Bitcoin millionaire or something. I won't be able to go there again. But it was beautiful to get the chance anyway. You can see this habitat has interesting maple trees, for example, in the middle of West Texas, over off to the right. Got some water that's pooling here. Just a nice habitat, and it really supports fireflies in this location. This is in an image of Honey Creek in Guadalupe River State Park. One of my favorite areas, Honey Creek is. It's just a really cool area with a lot of diverse stuff. It's one of my most amazing places to see fireflies in the springtime, just because it's a stream system or a spring that's never really dried up ever in its existence, as far as we know. And so what that's done is that it's just created a robust population of multiple species that it's existed, and it's never, you know, basically had too many threats to it. So it's a really neat place. You'll see here that this is different in terms of see how these cypress trees are really, really tall. And at night, what this does is that it creates a super dark habitat. And generally, if I'm looking in this direction, which I will oftentimes, I will see fireflies that are flashing in the distance here, right across on the other side of the stream, in this area where it's super, super dark. And they'll generally be flying about 5 inches off the ground. And generally, they're probably a female that's located here at the base of one of these trees. When I did a habitat study of this location a couple years ago, there was one of the docents out there that did it, and she told me this crazy story about how many years ago she saw this cypress stump that was shooting fireflies out at like a fireworks display. And I was like, well, that's really curious. I was like, a hollowed out stump that's just shooting out fireflies? She's like, yeah, let me show you. And so I was like, okay. And so she took me in the middle of the night down this narrow path to try to find this stump. We didn't find it, but we found a lot of other fantastic fireflies. So just a neat habitat. This property is the Stewart property in Bee Cave. These are some landowners that decided to rehabilitate a kind of a previously poor habitat. And this is a great example of how you can take a habitat that's like degraded and restore it. And it just, you can see it's very grassy. The thing to note here is that this used to be a stream that was full of water. And when they started planting a lot of native grasses, what the grasses did was kind of absorbed a lot of that water that came downstream. And so instead of the water leaving the property because it didn't have anywhere to go or wasn't able to be absorbed into the soil by the plants, now it's able to retain it because of the vegetation here. And then landowners note that, you know, they used to have a lot more water, but they don't have as much water anymore. And, you know, somebody was telling us to be like, oh, we don't have enough water. That's unfortunate. But Really what they're doing is they're keeping the moisture in their land. And let me tell you, they have some of the most amazing firefly habitat because of this. It is really remarkable because of what they've done. So I'm going to talk about a few of the species of fireflies here in Texas. Now, don't feel the need to write all this down. This is basically just a list to show you the different species types that are here in Texas. Some of these are relatively recent, especially in Photuris. Some are specific to Texas. But we got a lot of diversity here. And so we're really, really lucky in that. An example, Florida has about 50 species, and it has a wide variety of habitat types. So we're really fortunate to have about 40, 45 species here. Oh, in the evening, the most commonly type of firefly that you will encounter is going to be called Photinus fireflies. And Photinus is the most common type, as I mentioned. And we have about 15 to 20 species of fireflies. They cover a wide range from daytime flying species to nighttime flying species as well. And they include the common Big Dipper firefly, Photinus pyralis. And this is the one that you're most likely to see in your backyard or in your habitat. And it's one that makes a J shape. And just to note, these are the most numerous in the early evening. So if you go out this coming May and you'll see fireflies that coming out at like 9:15 or so, 8:45. This is the kind that you will likely see. So this is a relatively large firefly, about 9 to 15 millimeters. They've got a black wing cover with a yellow border. If you remember in the start of the presentation, I kind of talked about that specifically. They've got a noticeable black spot on their head here, or head shield on the pronotum. In Texas, though, about 50% of the time, it lacks this black spot. Now, if you were to go to Georgia or a state in the Northeast in the Mid-Atlantic, and you were to try to find Photinus pyralis, you would always find it with this black spot right here. But in Texas, it lacks that. Part of the reason for this is that the pyralis is kind of in a way like kind of becoming something else here. It is in a way a morphotype of our area, and genetic work's been done to kind of show this a little bit, but it couldn't be classified really as a unique species yet. So we've got kind of unique locally adapted pyralis here in Texas. And they will flash every 4 to 6 seconds, and they make a distinctive J shape, as shown here. This is an endemic species here in Texas called Photinus concisus. This is another one that you will likely see in Comal County, and it is the difference between it is that it flashes every 2 to 2.7 seconds, so it's going to flash a lot faster than the Photinus pyralis. And it always will generally lack a pronotal spot here. The other thing too is that females will respond really quickly, 0.6 seconds as opposed to 2 seconds for pyralis. So that's one of the ways we tell them apart. They occur in kind of a range here in the hill country here. This video that I'm about to show you was taken last year in Austin, in Zilker Park area, in one of the Greenbelt areas. For whatever reason, this area is called the Violet Crown Trail. So if you want a good firefly watching spot that's easily accessible, this coming year in May to June, this would be a great habitat to visit, the Violet Crown Trail. So I'm going to show you a video of concisus flashing. And what this video is going to show is some synchronization to their flashing. A lot of people don't really know, especially even in Texas, is that we do have species that also synchronize as well. Maybe not as consistent as some of the species in the Northeast, like in Tennessee, but they do synchronize somewhat in parts of Texas here too. Now, you'll see kind of some times where they do tend to flash at the same time, and they kind of are very reactive. It was absolutely brilliant here. I will warn you though, if you go see this trail in Austin, it is littered with poison ivy on each side of the trail. So as long as you keep your arms inside, don't touch any vegetation, you'll be fine. But otherwise, it is ripe for getting into poison ivy. So in that video you saw, you could see some flashing going on and some kind of flashing where that occurred kind of a similar time. The that you just saw in that video is this one that's shown on the screen now. Photinus concisus, and this is the male form. This is the black morphotype form that doesn't have the yellow margin here. But this is what you would see. It also has a kind of it doesn't have a yellow portions on that abdominal segment right there either. This is what the female looks like there. I found some females in that video there studying that habitat. You can see that she's got that one light region right there. And, you know, she's got kind of a longer abdomen as well. Just some beautiful photos that Mike Quinn took. This is another type of firefly that we have here in Texas, Photinus stellaris. One of my favorite types because they produce just really, really amazing flash swarms, basically, and they occur in large numbers. It's a very small firefly, though. It's about 5 to 9 millimeters, so it can be like small as a grain of rice. It's got all black wing covers here, and it occurs from central to west Texas. These generally occur in areas that tend to be drier. So you will see these in bases of cedar trees, for example. And it's one of the fireflies that is very threatened in the hill country because people decide that cedar trees aren't native or get some weird notions in their heads and decide to cut down all cedar trees. But this is a firefly that actually kind of prefer living under the base of cedar tree because of all of the basically the vegetation that, or the material that it throws off creates a pretty dense, thick thatch. I just oftentimes will find these near those places, and they tend to prefer the darkness of those cedar breaks sometimes too. So this is an example of a good firefly. There was a book recently written about cedar trees in Texas that I read. It was really fascinating, and this firefly would be a good case study for a firefly that depends on those trees. They have a very fast flash pattern, about 1 second to 0.07 seconds. And then they have a low arcing kind of flash, and they like to fly bushes. So what a female Photinus stellaris looks like. This image is this firefly female hadn't been photographed in 100 years until 2 years ago to what I was able to find it. My friend Curran actually found this particular one, and we were lucky enough to get it photographed. But just beautiful coloration. You'll notice that she doesn't have any wings really. She's got like vestigial wings that basically are reduced, and she doesn't have any need for them. So just over time, they basically just reduce to the point of little stubs, little angel wings, somebody once called them. She's very interested in leg egg laying, particularly because of how small those fireflies are and how few of them actually survive. So they need to produce more in order to survive. This is common in the animal kingdom. Bees, butterflies, just a variety of things do this. You know, we can outwit the competitors by just producing more. This is a size comparison just to give you an idea. This photo was so hard to take. Imagine trying to get two fireflies next to each other to take a photo. And the concisus on the left and then stellaris on the right. Like, just see the difference in them right there. This is the second genera, basically, or genus of fireflies called Photuris. These generally occur in late May to late June in Texas, and they're very large fireflies. You can see off to the right, you might notice some kind of differences. They have bigger eyes, kind of hunchbacked here. They kind of look a little bit more like predators. They're really impossible to ID based on flash pattern. Dissection or DNA analysis really doesn't work. So the really only way to ID them is based on the male flash pattern, because females, and then the females will also eat other fireflies, and they do this basically to get compounds that makes them poisonous to other predators like spiders and birds and bats. So I put this in here because it's just kind of fun to talk about. One of the most complicated firefly flash patterns in the United States right now. Flash patterns before, how there could be a difference between interval of time, number of flashes. So this is one of the most complicated flash patterns out there right now. And not to say there isn't more complicated, but the most complicated right now that I know of. Basically, it's 5 flashes of glow plus 2 more flashes and then another glow pulse kind of thing. This is some kind of extreme sexual selection going on, where there might be a lot of different firefly species occurring in one area. In order to differentiate, they kind of do, some crazy flashes out there. This is seen also elsewhere in the animal kingdom. Like, you can think about birds of paradise, for example, with those extreme plumage and different mating dances and calls and stuff like that. Some of these things happen in insects as well. And with fireflies, it's less documented, but this was a firefly that was documented in 2019 by Lynn Foss, and just got a unique flash train glow. And it's in the swamps of Waldockley State Park in Mississippi. I've been here because it could maybe be in East Texas. There's another species that's just like it, that another researcher identified, and the jury's still out whether they're kind of the same or not, but it could occur here if you're in a swampy kind of habitat like shown off to the right. Resident Photuris here in Texas, Cat Rene, named after a firefly researcher. And it's a pretty large firefly. Sometimes we call these the big scaries because they're predator fireflies. Before, and I've kind of predicted I like pick one up, be like, I think it's probably going to bite me. It's pretty pissed off, and sure enough, it tries to. Not that it's like painful or anything, but they do have mandibles that are able to chew, whereas other fireflies don't have that. Pretty widespread in all of Texas. Have a very erratic flash pattern. It's able to mimic like up to 11 different flashes of other species. So very confusing firefly, kind of hard to study. Only you can base it on. This is an example of firefly, not a male, I'm sorry, a Photuris firefly. I don't know if it's male or not, flashing in a habitat. And this is a time-lapse photo that's been assembled over a number of photos, just so you can see the trail that it's flashing as it kind of meanders down, and then it kind of flies over the trees. Kind of really curious, kind of see what's going on here. That's what some of these were doing, but you see some that are lower down here, and this might be something different as opposed to what's flying here. But a definite time interval between them is pretty, consistent, which is neat. And likely it was the firefly that I showed in the previous photo. This is our other type, kind of last one I'll mention in this group. This is our gentler type. It's a rarer species here in Texas. We have it in Comal County. In fact, you could probably drive 15 miles or less than that, 5 miles down the road right now and find it. It's one of my favorite Photuris because it synchronizes its flash. Just absolute joy to watch. It has what's kind of a double flicker flash every about 1 second or so, and it's a kind of a slower flyer. And you can actually if you're in the right environment, you can actually like walk along one of them while they're flashing, and it's just a really fun one. Last one, this is a new genus, Pyractomena, just to show you, if you're going down to the coast, let's say down to Rockport or Port O'Connor or some of those, even Galveston, you might encounter this type, and you'll also encounter it in South Texas. This is what's called Pyractomena. These are generally encountered singly or in small groups, and are seldom found in huge groups like in other genera. And they're most often found near water or swampy habitats, but also in the drier portions of South Texas, and even some of the coastal regions down there as well. And they're known for their amber-colored flash patterns. So big difference, amber-colored flash patterns. They come out between April and June. This is kind of what they look like. Probably don't look much different than the ones you just showed me, Ben. And yeah, you're pretty right. There's subtle differences, but a completely different genus. And they have a pronounced, you kind of see this like triangular right here on that, really kind of differentiates them. And they flash every 4 seconds or so. And you'll see them early evening. And then lastly, this is kind of some other species that you might encounter here in Texas. Pleiotmus pallens over off to the left. This is kind of the cute firefly, I like to call it, because it's got these like little feathery antenna. It's more of a pheromone-based firefly. It is able to glow once it initially pupates, and it's kind of neat. But once it becomes a full-fledged adult, after it pupates, then it doesn't really flash anymore. It just uses pheromones, and this is a larva of that type of firefly shown here. These guys will glow pretty periodically along the ground. Off to the right is a Aspisoma. This was a firefly that was seen in 2020, and it's just a rare, super rare form of firefly. Here, it's only been really seen 4 times since 1935. There used to probably be this genus of fireflies that lived here in Texas, but is long since probably gone. There's some fireflies that occurred in like Monaghan sand dunes in Texas, but since the aquifer pumping out there is pretty much gone, since the time of the 70s is the last time it was seen. So somebody posted this photo on iNaturalist, and it was quite a bit of sensation because, I mean, look how crazy this thing looks. It's got these weird spots and stuff like that. This is along the border of Mexico and Cameron County. Did it fly over across the border? Who knows? Border Patrol didn't obviously catch it, so it's here. And just a neat thing. We think it's a different species than a thing that occurs in West Texas, but just neat. So that's the value of 9Nat. And just wanted to thank you for attending. There's ways to contact me. If you've got any questions, email, text message is good. It's my personal phone number. Visit the website. I will be launching the Firefly Habitat sign around February sometime, and we're working out the website stuff right now for ordering. It's kind of a complicated thing to do all this and get it shipping and printing and stuff like that. So I look forward to doing that, and hope y'all be glad to support that when it comes about. It's gonna be a neat thing. I'm gonna go ahead and